Right, so get ready. Because today we are diving deep into a future that honestly sounds more like science fiction than anything else. Like, think a world completely after fossil fuels, a world that some people are even calling post-scarcity. And for this deep dive, we're really going way beyond, the typical like solar panels and wind turbines, because you shared with me this article that really paints a much more radical and honestly kind of mind-blowing picture. So that's what I want to unpack with you today. What are the most impactful and intriguing arguments for like a world beyond fossil fuels?
Yeah. And it's interesting because I feel like these conversations often start with, what we think we already know, right? Like go green, get solar panels, switch to electric car. Like all those things are important and they're crucial steps. But I think what this article highlights really well is why all of that is really just scratching the surface.
Yeah, it's like we're constantly being told and reassured that like we've got this, like we can innovate our way out of the climate crisis. But this article kind of throws us a curveball.
It really does because it dives straight into the hard realities of like resource management, or I guess you could say like the lack thereof. And specifically, it highlights some existing research that shows that even if we went all in like 100% on the current green technologies that we have right now, we would still hit a critical shortage in terms of the minerals needed to actually scale those technologies globally. So we're talking about hitting a wall, not necessarily in terms of like our ingenuity or innovation, but in terms of the raw materials that our planet is actually able to provide.
Yeah. Wow, that's kind of a sobering thought, right? It's so easy to get swept up in the optimism of technology and these like shiny new solutions. But this really brings us back down to earth, literally.
Yeah.
So I guess the question then becomes, are we then talking about a future where we're all kind of forced to scale back or like accept a lower standard of living? Is that what we're talking about here?
Yeah, and that's where this whole concept of degrowth comes in. And I know before you even say it, when people hear degrowth, they immediately picture like a world lit by candles and powered by like hamsters on wheels. It's not about deprivation like that. It's more about shifting our focus from this idea of like endless economic growth on a planet with finite resources towards a more sustainable and equitable model.
So less about shrinking our lives and more about like rethinking our priorities, would you say?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Prioritizing well-being and ecological balance over this constant like material accumulation.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get a better picture of like the scope of what we're actually talking about here, but I'm curious to dive into some potential solutions here because if relying solely on existing green tech, like, isn't going to cut it, what does this article actually propose?
Yeah, so this is where things get really, really interesting because they dive into some radically different energy solutions.
Mm.
And one of the most compelling ones is molten salt thorium reactors.
Okay, I have to admit, when I hear nuclear, my alarm bells definitely start ringing. I mean, Chernobyl, Fukushima, those are not exactly comforting images.
And for good reason, but these are not your typical nuclear reactors. These thorium reactors operate at a much lower temperature, which significantly reduces the risk of meltdowns. And then on top of that, the article highlights how incredibly efficient they are. Like we're talking a 50-year fuel cycle, which is insane compared to the 2-year cycle of traditional reactors. So imagine like refueling a power plant once in a lifetime.
Wow, okay,
Yeah.
that's impressive. But what about the radioactive waste, though? Because I feel like that's always been like the Achilles heel of nuclear power.
And that's actually another area where these thorium reactors really shine because they produce just a fraction of the waste compared to traditional reactors. And that waste is also far less radioactive and long-lived, so it's definitely a game changer.
So we're talking about a potentially safer, more efficient, and less wasteful form of nuclear power. It seems like, okay, that's pretty amazing. But the article doesn't stop there, does it? Like it goes even further in terms of rethinking our entire relationship with resources.
Yeah, absolutely. It dives into this fascinating idea of a circular economy, where waste is seen as a valuable resource rather than just a problem that needs to be disposed of. And they give this really like striking example of using human sewage to create energy.
Okay, now that's not something you hear every day, I have to admit. I'm definitely intrigued, but also maybe a little grossed out, so you have to tell me more.
Okay, so think about it this way. We're basically talking about using a readily available waste product to fuel a process that in turn can generate even more energy. So the article specifically mentioned burning iron powder for industrial heat, which creates iron oxide, basically rust. And then by combining that rust with hydrogen that's generated from treated sewage, you can actually convert it back into iron powder, which is then ready to be burned again.
So it's like a completely closed loop, turning what we consider waste into a valuable resource. That's pretty remarkable. It feels like we're on the verge of entering a whole new era of industrial processes.
And that's just one example. Imagine applying this principle to other industries like manufacturing or agriculture. The possibilities are huge.
It's like we're shifting from this very linear take, make, dispose model to something that's much more cyclical that actually kind of mimics natural ecosystems. Like we're taking design cues from nature itself, but obviously all of this requires a pretty massive shift in perspective, right?
Absolutely. It requires a really fundamental change in how we view resources, energy, and I think just our place within the natural world in general. And it goes way beyond just technological innovation. This is also going to require a pretty big societal shift as well.
And that's where things get really interesting because we're not just talking about new energy sources, we're talking about a whole new way of organizing society.
Exactly. And that's actually where we're going to pick back up in the next part of our deep dive. We're going to actually explore this concept of a resource-based economy.
Okay, so we're back. And I have to admit, this whole idea of a resource-based economy, it's definitely intriguing, but I'm kind of having a hard time picturing what that would actually look like in reality. Like, it almost feels kind of utopian, you know?
Yeah, I get that it's a term that can sometimes evoke like images of these like idealistic communes or like futuristic societies straight out of science fiction.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And while those things are definitely fun to think about, they don't exactly scream like practical or sustainable, especially not in the long run.
Right. And the article actually addresses that concern. It makes this interesting point that we've already seen examples of resource-based principles working really well for centuries, even just on a smaller scale.
Really? Okay, you're gonna have to give me some examples because I'm drawing a blank here.
Sure, think about like Amish communities. They've maintained a way of life for generations now that's based on shared resources, communal decision making, and a really strong emphasis on craftsmanship and sustainability.
You know what? That's actually a really good point. I've never really connected the dots there. But you're right. They've managed to create a system that really works for them, but then scaling that up to like a global level that feels like a completely different ballgame.
Yeah, and the article acknowledges that a global resource-based economy wouldn't be like a one-size-fits-all model that's kind of imposed from the top down. Instead, they propose this concept of a flexible social contract, which is more like a framework that allows for adaptation and evolution based on like local context and technological advancements.
So more like a set of guiding principles as opposed to like a rigid blueprint.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I can get behind that. So what would you say are like some of the core principles of this like flexible social contract?
So one of the key ideas is this shift away from like centralized power structures towards more like distributed and localized systems of governance.
That makes sense because, I mean, centralized systems can be really slow, inefficient, and obviously very prone to corruption. But how do you actually ensure fairness in a system like that? And like, how do you prevent abuse if things are more decentralized?
That's where things get really interesting. The article suggests that a well-designed resource-based economy would actually naturally minimize a lot of the drivers of conflict and power struggles that we see today.
Okay, now you've got my attention. Tell me more about that.
Okay, so think about it this way. If resources are being managed intelligently and sustainably in a way that actually meets everyone's basic needs, then the incentive to hoard wealth and power diminishes significantly.
That's true.
The focus then shifts from like individual accumulation to more like collective well-being.
So it's not about like eliminating individual ambition, but more about like redirecting it towards goals that are more collaborative and sustainable.
Exactly.
Okay, I like that.
Mm.
And that actually brings us back to technology a little bit, because we've
Oh.
talked about the potential of things like thorium reactors and like these circular manufacturing processes. So how would those technologies actually help to enable this new societal model?
I think these innovations are really crucial because they provide a pathway towards abundance in a way that doesn't rely on exploiting finite resources or concentrating wealth and power in the hands of just a few.
Right.
Like, for example, decentralized energy production could really empower local communities and reduce our reliance on these massive corporations.
So it feels like we're really talking about a very fundamental shift in power dynamics. And not just in terms of energy, but really in like all aspects of society.
Yeah, and that kind of systemic change that we're talking about that doesn't just happen overnight, the article really emphasizes this multi-pronged approach that focuses on both immediate actions and long-term research and development.
So it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
What are some of the concrete steps we can be taking right now to kind of move in the direction of this resource-based future?
Yeah, so the article actually points to cities as being like key testing grounds for a lot of these new ideas, and they envision these things called innovation hubs, which would be like centers within urban environments that are completely dedicated to experimenting with and implementing these sustainable solutions.
So like real-world laboratories for a resource-based future. What would these innovation hubs actually focus on?
They would be hubs for developing and testing everything from renewable energy microgrids and sustainable transportation systems to circular manufacturing processes and urban farming initiatives.
I love that idea of like integrating nature back into our cities. Like it's about time we move beyond these concrete jungles. But let's go back to transportation for a second, because we touched on some potential alternatives earlier, like using ammonia as a fuel source.
Yeah, and while that might sound kind of unusual, it has some real potential, especially for like heavy industries that are really difficult to electrify. But even beyond like specific technologies, the article really emphasizes a more holistic approach to urban design, and they specifically mention this idea of taking inspiration from permaculture.
Permaculture. Now, that's usually something I associate with like gardening and agriculture.
Yes.
So how does that apply to something as complex as a city?
That's a good question. It's really about applying like nature's principles of interconnectedness and resource cycling to design systems that are inherently sustainable. So imagine cities where buildings actually mimic ecosystems with waste from one process becoming a valuable resource for another.
So instead of having all these separate isolated systems, it's more about creating a closed loop, much like what we see in nature. But that requires a whole new way of thinking about design and engineering, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's about shifting away from that linear take, make, dispose mentality towards something that's much more circular that prioritizes regeneration and resilience.
It's like we're talking about designing cities that function more like living organisms, which is a pretty powerful image when you think about it.
Yeah.
But this all sounds incredibly complex. So how do we even begin to wrap our heads around such a fundamental transformation?
Okay, so we've talked about a lot, I mean, from the limitations of like our current green technologies to like these, yeah, it's definitely a shift in perspective. And the article really emphasizes that like this kind of societal transformation, it requires more than just, coming up with new technologies.
Right.
It demands a willingness to challenge some of our most deeply held assumptions about progress, about growth, even about what it really means to live like a fulfilling life.
It's like we're really being asked to sort of like reimagine the very fabric of our society. And while the potential benefits are huge, like if we're talking about a more sustainable future, a fairer distribution of resources, a world where we're not constantly like at odds with nature, the path to get there seems kind of daunting, to say the least.
It's a journey, not a destination. And the article really emphasizes that point, that it's about both short-term action and long-term vision. Like it's not about waiting for some perfect utopian future to kind of magically arrive. It's about taking those steps, however small they may seem in the present moment, to kind of create the conditions for that future to emerge.
So it's about planting seeds today, even if we might not be around to actually see them like fully blossom.
Exactly. And some of those seeds might seem a little out there. Like the article touches on some really mind-bending concepts like harnessing something called zero-point energy.
Okay, now we're like venturing into the realm of science fiction for sure. Remind me again, what is zero-point energy?
So it's basically the theoretical energy that's present in the vacuum of space itself, even at absolute zero temperature.
So we're talking about like tapping into an inexhaustible energy source that's literally all around us.
Yeah.
That sounds too good to be true.
It definitely does, and it's definitely on the fringes of our current scientific understanding, but I think the fact that it's even being seriously considered kind of speaks to this need for bold thinking and, this need to continue exploring these seemingly impossible ideas.
Yeah, I like that, staying open to possibilities. And it's not just like theoretical physics either. The article also mentions Nikola Tesla and his work on trying to harness energy from the environment.
Yeah, Tesla was such a visionary. And, while some of his ideas still remain kind of shrouded in mystery, I think his work really serves as an important reminder that there's still so much we don't know about the universe and our place within it.
Yeah, it's like we're standing at the edge of this like whole new frontier, not just in terms of technology, but in terms of like our understanding of what's even possible. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for like, zero-point energy to become a reality, what are some of the things that we can actually do like in the here and now?
Well, the article is very clear about the fact that we can't afford to just wait around for some future technological fix. It's really about taking action on multiple fronts simultaneously. We've talked about the potential of things like thorium reactors and circular economies and redesigned cities, but it goes even beyond that. It also has to involve a shift in our values from this very consumerist, individualistic culture to something that's more cooperative, more focused on sustainability.
Yeah, it's a tall order for sure, but
Yeah.
it feels like we're kind of at a crossroads. And like The choices that we make right now are really going to determine what direction we go.
And that's what makes this conversation so important, in my opinion. It's not about, doom and gloom. It's about acknowledging the very real challenges that we face while also being really honest about the incredible opportunities that emerge when we allow ourselves to imagine a very different kind of future.
A future that's not defined by scarcity and competition, but by, like you said, abundance and well-being for everyone.
Precisely. And I think ultimately it's about recognizing that our fates are very much interconnected, not just with each other, but with the planet itself.
That is a powerful message to end on. So to our listeners, we've explored some really big, really mind-expanding ideas today. And it's okay if you're feeling a little overwhelmed, because the key takeaway here is that the future is not something that's already been decided. It's something that we are actively creating every single day through the choices that we make and the actions that we take. So as you go about your day, just ask yourself, like, what kind of future do I want to be a part of? What kind of world do I want to live in? And what are those small steps that I can take to help create that?